Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be getting started right now, and I hope everyone's doing well. Aloha and welcome. My name is Andrea Nandoskar, and I'm the Education Program Manager at Historic Hawaii Foundation. And I want to thank you for joining us for the 37th Annual Experts Historic Preservation Lecture Series. I want to mahalo our event partner, Dr. Ralph Kam, who is with us, and he's the curator of the expert series. Dr. Kam is the executive director of Hawaiian Mission House's Historic Site and Archives, and the series is sponsored by the Historic Preservation Graduate Certificate Program, University of Hawaii at Manoa School of Architecture, and Historic Hawaii Foundation. This year's theme is Hawaii's Historic Preservation Pioneers, and today's presenter will speak about the Daughters of Hawaii. Just to note that we are recording the lecture and we're live streaming on HHF's YouTube and Facebook pages where they may be viewed and shared afterwards. Please type questions as the presenter presents today's lecture. Please type any questions in the chat and we'll collect those and respond at the end of the lecture, getting to as many as we can. And also there'll be a brief survey at the end. And thank you to those who've been here before. And thank you for completing that. It's really helpful. For those who may be new to Historic Hawaii Foundation, we are a statewide nonprofit that help people save historic places. And these are the sites that tell the stories of multi-layered history of Hawaii. We do this through education, advocacy, assistance, and protection of and for historic places. We were founded in June of 1974, and we're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. And without further ado, I welcome Dr. Ralph Kam to introduce today's presenter, and I hope you enjoyed the lecture.
Well, today's presenter is Patricia Morgan, and she comes from a long Kamehameha family history. 6th generation on her father's side and 4th generation on her mother's side. So you can see that the term Kamehameha definitely applies. Growing up, she attended Punahou School and then went on to graduate from Lewis and Clark College. She raised 2 children and held down various types of business jobs. And despite that part of her growing up, she had underneath a deep connection with the past, especially with a sense of amateur history, which I would call public history. Because I think that most amateur historians still do the depth of research that's necessary in that field. So she was enrolled as a lifetime member in both the Daughters of Hawaii and the Hawaiian Mission Children's Society at a very early age. And finally, when she was able to retire, she was pulled out of, I think, retirement into doing volunteer work with these organizations. So the nominating committee of the Daughters of Hawaii reached out to invite her to be on their board. And really her example was her grandmother, Julie Judd Swansea, the longest serving regent of the Daughters of Hawaii. And the Hawaiian Mission Children's Society followed soon after. Someone said, without the past, there is no future. The present is the bridge that connects them. Helping people understand the past in order to make a more positive and informed decision about the future directions are the core of what or why Patricia is drawn to history. I think you'll see in this presentation the things that have been saved, but also the things that have been lost over time. And I think I'm glad that we have individuals who are willing to spend time working to help preserve. And certainly the Daughters of Hawaii is one such organization. So without further ado, Patricia Morgan.
Hey, well, aloha, everybody. I don't know if anybody else attending this presentation has been asked to be a guest speaker, but my immediate reaction, as Ralph knows, is like, why me? And as he said, so I figured maybe if I'm asking why me, some of you are asking why me. He kind of just answered a lot of that. But to elaborate, all of the people in front of me, my mother, my grandmothers, and this is on both sides, have all been interested in history. And what I've found in talking to friends and acquaintances and all kinds of people over the years, there aren't actually that many people who have such a sense. For instance, I can easily talk about all 6 generations or 4 generations behind me. And it's I take that somewhat for granted. And I realize a lot of people don't. So when I say I'm an amateur professional, but it's also that whole thing that's been instilled from birth, so to speak. And so I guess that's part of why I got sucked into this. And so, yes, the women of my family have been members of the Daughters and the mission houses since birth. And the one thing I would correct, Ralph, is it wasn't my grandmother, it was my great-grandmother, was Julie Jed Swansea, 4th Regent. Anyway, so the next reaction I had was, what in the world am I going to say? So I have to say that the part of history that really intrigues me the most is the who and the why. To me, the what is the foundation. If you're talking about a war, an event, or what, that's just somewhat fact. It's a thing. But who got involved and why? And what do they bring to the game? That, to me, is what history is really all about. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, is the who, the why, and the what. But just because this is this historic Hawaii Foundation, I'd like to start with just a really quick, I'm not big into dates, but I thought this was interesting as I got ready to find this. So a little bit of timeline context. The Hawaiian National Museum was actually established in 1872. In 1889, the Bishop Museum was established. In 1889. In 1892, then, and a few years after Bishop Museum, the Hawaiian National Museum, if some of you have not heard of it, their collections were transferred over to the Bishop Museum. In 1892, the Hawaiian Historic Society was formed for the purpose, and I'm going to quote this, collection, study, and utilization of all material for a complete record as possible of the origin and progress of the Hawaiian Islands, end quote. That was back in 1892. Okay, 1898, the Republic of Hawaii passed a law to provide funds and the right of eminent domain for the acquisition and maintenance of historic places. 1903 is when the Daughters of Hawaii came along, and their core mission at that time, which it basically still is, quote, was to perpetuate the memory and spirit of old Hawaii and to preserve the nomenclature and correct pronunciation of the Hawaiian language, end quote. And just because this is kind of who I am, I can't help comment that in 1906, the United States finally passed its first Antiquities Act. So they're kind of way behind Hawaii in that facet. But I like to make comments like that, so bear with me. Back to 1903 and the Daughters of Hawaii. So who were these women? So there was originally 7 women that got together and decided to do this. Emma Dillingham, Cornelia Jones, Annie Dickey, Ellen Weaver, Anna Paris, Lucinda Severance, and Sarah Waters. I think it's interesting to note they were all born between the years 1842 and 1844, which made them all dancing around 60 at the time they formed the Daughters of Hawaii. The really important thing I want to call out is they were all born in Hawaii. They were all citizens of the monarchy. Their formative years, and what I might loosely call the prime of life, was all spent under Hawaiian monarchical rule. They considered themselves Hawaiian, not by DNA, but by right of birth. And it's something I feel. One of the most interesting points is that I think many people don't realize, they had no strong ties to any other culture than that which they were born into. Their parents had all immigrated into the Hawaiian Islands at the time and embraced their new home. Obviously, you don't go flipping back to the East Coast to immerse yourself in your past in that era. And so the monarchy was the culture they grew up with, and stretching back beyond that. So it's to me, it's no wonder they felt the loss after the overthrow and all the changes that went in of the culture that they knew. It was the only one they were anchored to. Additionally, as to what made them who they were, remembering they were all born into missionary families, they were raised with a strong sense of duty and service to community. That passed all the way down to me. We were still pounded into that when I was growing up. You must serve. So with this background, it's not surprising their focus was on culture and language. Because along with culture, which I've just mentioned, it's language that underlies most of our communication efforts. And one could make the argument that the culture and history of a place can best be described in the language in place at the time of the events. Additionally, place names provide anchors. How many of you, if you grew up here in Hawaii like I did, grew up giving directions to a place via names, somebody's house, a tree, the big rock? That's how we navigate. And names also provide historical context and meaning. So in a nutshell, when they talked about nomenclature and language, that's part of the anchor they're trying to anchor that culture in. So with that, the first formal meeting was held on December 1st of 1903. Officers were elected, rules established, and of course, discussion about who else is going to join us. We need more members. It's interesting to me, and not surprising, that rather than have a president, they chose to have a regent, which I think is really a nod of the hat, probably and primarily to Ka'ahumanu. It's also indicative of their intent that in addition to the somewhat normal officers, they had a position of historian. As an officer, that person was, quote, to have charge of all papers of historic value and present in written form any matters of interest related to the Hawaii of the Hawaiians. The rules, which were later formed into bylaws, were accepted and as the guiding principles under which they would function. Membership would be restricted to women born in Hawaii and who also had ancestors living in the islands prior to 1860. Subsequently, that date has changed a few times. It presently is settled on 1880. I should also point out that there is now a less restrictive class of membership, the Calabash Cousins. Those discussions actually did not start until the late 1970s and were not actually put into effect until January of 1985, when the bylaws were amended by a vote of the whole membership, which I have to say is very late in the game from my perspective. And having been on the board, been a regent, I absolutely have to tip my hand to the huge support that all the Calabash Cousins give to the Daughters of Hawaii. They're been extremely valuable over the years, and before they were legitimately Calabash Cousins, so to speak. Anyway, moving on back to 1903, they set forth the requirement in the meetings, the requirement of the meetings, they would include either a reading or a talk pertinent to the aims of the society, and that also vocal music with a distinctly Hawaiian flavor would be a part of every meeting. And just putting right out there, we're going to walk our talk about the importance of history and culture. Their motto was and remains, the ring of friendship never molts a feather. The feather was chosen as a crest, and a yellow feather lei was the insignia. It was also the original intent that the annual social meeting be held on April 30th, picked because it was the anniversary date of the Battle of Nu'uanu, which cemented Kamehameha I's monarchy. I think it's another nod to the monarchy era, in particular the Kamehameha dynasty under which they grew up under. I do have to mention, however, adherence to the April 30th date proved problematical, starting with the very first annual meeting, which was actually held on the 15th due to some conflict with the 30th. Who knew? Anyway, the next big push was enlarge the membership. Naturally, it started with friends and family. The first 12 additional members voted in included 6 descendants of the Hawaiian Ali'i and 6 additional descendants from missionary families. And the numbers grew from there. Taking a quick beat forward to the here and now, there is around 4,000 members, give or take, located literally around the world. The most recent country with a member happens to be the Netherlands. I like miscellaneous data. With that, I'm about to dive into the what's, but I'd like to digress just quickly with a perusal of the minutes of the meetings from the first years, validating they were walking their talk, so to speak. So that first membership meeting, the feature of the evening was a paper about Kamehameha I and the Battle of Nu'uanu, written by their historian Anna Paris. There was also a musical program. At the close, they sang Aloha Oi and Hawaii Pono'i. Following meetings always included music and a number of historical or educational pieces. Examples include the history of Pa'au and his long voyage, written by a Kamehameha student. A valuable paper was read by Mr. Joseph Emerson on a legend of the 15th century. Another paper by Anna Paris about the once the once famous King Umi. James Wilder was invited, son of Kina'u Judd Wilder, who recounted stories about the Kuhinanui Kina'u and promised to put it in writing. I don't know if it happened. There was one on the passing of the Hawaiian taboo system, an account by member Emma Nakuina of the memories of the Battle of Oahu as told by old Hawaiians during her childhood days. Nathaniel Emerson presented, also encouraged to put it down, which he did. He published his unwritten literature of Hawaii in 1909, Legend of Pele and Hi'iaka in 1915. And so it went. Today, the tradition continues with the daughters having a monthly Monday talk stories via Zoom. What would founders think of Zoom? Goodness. Okay, what's the first big project was discussion around having a plaque to commemorate the Battle of Nu'uanu. That started in 1904. It took them till 1908 to see it into fruition.
Excuse me, Patricia. I'm so
Yes.
sorry to interrupt. Do you want Michelle to advance your slides? You just need to let her know.
No, I'll let her know. I unfortunately, the plaque is no longer there. and the only picture I could find of it, I really didn't want to use. It was not indicative, and it had already been vandalized. But anyway, so there were, talks about where are we going to put it, what's it going to cost, what are we going to say on it. Took them till 1906 to figure out what the language is going to be. And then it was, okay, where's it going to be? Is it going to be on a boulder in the vicinity of the battle? Finally, in 1907, they figured it out and had to get the permission to place the plaque on the cliff at the crest of the Pully. For those of you that are of my age vintage, and we used to drive over the top of the Pully as you went from here to Kaneohe, it was on your right-hand side. There was and you can still see the carve-out niche. So they finally went ahead. They let the contract in 1908 to Mr. Mackenzie. It was on. They thought they were getting close, but 2 months later, he let them know, nope, there was a blast related to road work. Niche was filled with debris. Further work had to be done. Finally, in June of 1909, the long-awaited unveiling took place with the appropriate ceremonies and around 50 people in attendance. So then they were on to the next. The next big one was 1911. They decided to focus on the birthstone of Kauikeaouli in Keauhou, Hawaii. To those that like it the easier way, that would be Kamehameha III, who became king at age 11. And that's when he officially became Kamehameha III. In actuality, obviously, at age 11, the Kuhina Nui Ka'ahumanu was still primarily the reigner, and she'd done during Liholiho's reign. At any rate, the Committee of Daughters, they appointed a committee to research the whole thing and went up to Keauhou and found, guess what? There'd already been a stone wall put around it. And as the property belonged to the estate of Bernice Pawahi Bishop, and there was a caretaker. So they talked to him, and he was delighted with the idea and said, well, how can I help? So during the next year, several more daughters went up on a steamship to Kona to talk to the old timers and get a sense. And decision was made to get a local stone cutter to cut the marker. And in the interest of time, there's a whole bunch of fascinating stories around the birth, and I'm not going to get into it today, but you can certainly look it up. At any rate, the existing stone wall was left in place, but there was a short wrought iron fence and gates were added. And now let's go to that first slide, please. There you go. There's your wrought iron fence. The interesting thing is also recorded and you can just see kind of I'm going to get my left and my rights because I know I'm looking at a mirror, but you can kind of see the stone behind. Do note the two kind of stone columns with a head of coral in the front. Originally speaking, the committee had found that some of the granite posts that were originally out in front of Iolani Palace were available. So they bought 2 of them and then had the tops carved into balls to resemble the kapu sticks or pulu'ulo'u, and had them shipped up to Keaho and put there. I couldn't tell you what happened to those because obviously I think this photo was taken around 1930 or so, and they were gone by then. At any rate, that was, as I say, around 1930. The plaque was finally completed in late 1913, and the unveiling plans were finalized. But there was a last kerfluffle. It had been thought for years that Kauikeaouli's birth date was 1814. That's what they put on the plaque. However, Thomas Thrum published a paper stating new evidence indicated he'd been born March 17th, 1813. So then there was a huge fluff among the daughters saying, oh my God, what do we do? Lots of discussions. It finally went to a vote for the full membership to leave the date as 1814, since that had been a long established usage. So much for history. Having made the decision, all the stops were pulled out. First, there was a ceremony at Kauikeaouli Church in Honolulu, March 17th, 1914, centennial +1 of the birth. Invitations written in Hawaiian were sent to all the ahahui, the Hawaiian societies. Advance notice was put in the paper inviting the whole public. There were over 2,000 people showed up. The governor, at the time, Lucas Pinkham, had permitted the daughters to borrow a couple thrones and a portrait of the king for the occasion. There were also kahili, feather capes, and kapu stones. The stone tablet itself was draped in flags. Liliuokalani was present and sat on one throne. On the other sat the high chiefess, Elizabeth Kikaaniau Pratt, a member of the daughters, friend, and former classmate of the queen. The two of them removed the flag while Nahaha Hakaoli chanted Kauikeaouli life-giving prayer. That was followed by speeches, a musical presentation by the Kamehameha School Glee Club, and was truly noted by many people an unforgettable experience. The second ceremony then was held August 15th at the site in Keaho. That again was an equally impressive event. The day before, a large group sailed by steamer from Honolulu to Kona. Again, notable inclusion. Liliuokalani had been Chamberlain Curtis Iaukea, High Chiefess Pratt, Prince Jonah Kalanianaoli, and many members of the daughters, headed by then Regent Julie Judd Swansea. The ship was met in the harbor by a flotilla of canoes manned by paddlers wearing feather capes and lei. Just for interest, you can go to the next slide now. And that's another stone. That's a more recent picture, obviously, of the stone itself. So the tablet was lowered from the ship onto the canoes and then paddled down to Keaho. Once at Keaho, it was carried ashore by 12 descendants of some of the warrior chiefs to the site itself. The queen and her party sat under a tent. And I think there's one more slide of this. No, never mind. Back one, sorry. So the queen and her party sat under a tent, which was erected for the ceremony. The Reverend Stephen DeShaw spoke about good deeds of Kamehameha III. And to this day, well, actually, I should take a little bit of a side. Fast forward, 1980s, Kamehameha Investment Corp, subsidiary Bishop Estate, applied for a rezoning permit to hotel resort use for 765 acres on Keaho Bay. The original plans called for a 600-room hotel on the bluff overlooking the birth site. The daughters, led by member Barbara Nobriga, who is from that area and was chairman of the birthplace committee, jumped in to ensure the preservation of the site and improvement and ongoing maintenance. The original hotel plans were on the bluff were actually abandoned, but the KIC did keep its promise to improve the site. And now there's a new rock wall built along the path. There's a new path kind of to the one side, not the side where you saw the gate on the previous, but the other side. There's a very nice path, native trees, Lawai. And the daughters continue to hold a celebration at the site every year on March 17th, and which I had the honor of attending when I was regent. And it's really quite moving. Okay, so moving on, 1913, even during planning for all the events around the birth site, the daughters became aware of another threat to history. And now you can go to the next slide. In November, the Board of Supervisors were presented with a plan to improve Nu'uanu Park, including a recommendation that, quote, an old building on the grounds in a severe state of disrepair and without any value be demolished, end quote. That old building was originally known as Hulihe on the grounds known as Hanaiakamalama, more commonly known now as Queen Emma Summer Palace. And that's an older picture of it. The Pacific Commercial Advertiser published an editorial chiding the Board of Supervisors, and I just love this, for thinking that a park, quote, should be a leveled off, grassed, open barnyard lot where the lads can wallop the opposing nine from the next valley any Saturday afternoon. Needless to say, some of the daughters read the paper, went up to visit the home immediately, and called a special meeting the next day. The members that had gone up included a report that the condition of the house was not as bad as inferred and could probably be repaired at a reasonable cost. It was also suggested the daughters seek jurisdiction over the house, and they consider furnishing at least one room with things formerly belonging to Queen Emma and potentially other Hawaiian artifacts. A committee 4 was appointed. They called on the mayor and the supervisors to seek support for preserving it and hopefully provide financial help. Financial help was not provided at that time, but they did agree to let the house remain intact. Irene Holloway, who was actually the third regent, I'm not sure I think she was regent at that time, at any rate, she chaired the committee to raise the necessary preservation funds. The first event was a delicaissant. It featured and luncheon. The members made many assorted delicacies, along with a lunch consisting of poultry, meats, pies, cakes, Hawaiian dishes, salads, Hawaiian rolls, baked beans, brown bread, iced coffee, and homemade candies. They netted a whopping $682.30, which actually for those days was a pretty nice pot of money. So they continued to fundraise, and they also started the process of getting some legal jurisdiction to the property to ensure their efforts were not wasted. Government ran slowly in those days, although arguably maybe not quite as slowly as today. At any rate, 2 years later, April 27th, 1915, Act 188 was passed, authorizing the governor to set aside by executive order, quote, a certain piece of property in Hanaiakamalama, Kauikeaouli, Nu'uanu Valley, Honolulu, Hawaii, known as Queen Emma House Reservation, for the purpose to maintain and caring for such property as a Hawaiian museum. Excuse me. Governor Pinkham signed the order on July 20th, and with that, the Daughters of Hawaii were officially in the museum business. It took them another 2 years to complete renovations and gather the necessary furnishings and artifacts. In 1917, the official opening took place. Also in 1917 then, flip to the next slide. There's another view of the house as it kind of originally was. I believe this is in the 1930s. And the next one. Oh, nope. I put it at the end. We'll see the end ones later. Let's go back. Sorry, I forgot which order I put the slides in. And so their next big push then, also in 1917, when they were finishing up the one, it was suggested that the society approached the trustees of the Bishop estate to see if they could obtain the grass house known as Halilama in Waikiki and move it up to Hanaiakamalama. Halipili were becoming a rarity, and Halilama was on the grounds of the Seaside Hotel, which later turned into the Royal Hawaiian Hotel. At first, the trustees declined, thinking, no, it's too fragile to move. They later changed their minds, maybe, just maybe, because one of the trustees was a member of the Daughters. At any rate, in July of 1919, it was transported and set down in front of what used to be a fernery on the side of the entrance road up to the house. As part of the whole process and doing their historical due diligence, which they also always did, they realized that this hale was actually originally called Halumoa and was built for Kauikeaouli in Waikiki, the area down there of Halumoa. Excuse me, my mouth is getting parched. And so it had likely fallen into disrepair. It had been rebuilt by Kamehameha V in 1867. So they got all prepared, they got it up there. Unfortunately, they did not take into account the difference between the climate of Waikiki and Nu'uanu. Pili grass does not hold up well in Nu'uanu, and roof leaks became an immediate problem. Additionally, it was difficult to get pili grass, which typically can only be harvested in May and June of each year. And there was growing lack thereof. And 2 years appeared to be the longest a pili grass roof could last in Nu'uanu. Many different options were suggested: nets, canvas, fake roof. Some were tried, some were just discounted as, okay, that's going to ruin the look, let's not do it. Long story short, they struggled for 20 years and innumerable roofs and finally gave up. The Kamehameha School for Girls in Kapalama Heights offered to take it, and it moved again. Just to wrap up that story, in 1942, the school was taken over for use as a wartime hospital. When the property was returned in 1946, the house was gone. Okay, now we can go to the next slide, and we're jumping back to 1918. That was when the Daughters were made aware of the site Kukani Loko, or sometimes known casually as the birthstones. It was always historically known as a very sacred birthing ground, and also likely to be a site for astronomical observations. It's kind of located in an area near the town of Wahiawa, considered to be the Pico of Hawaii, of Oahu. Mr. Goodell, who was the manager of Wailua Plantation, actually sent the daughters a letter about the site because it was in the middle of his plantation, so to speak, and indicated its import from a Hawaiian historic perspective, and said it had been neglected for many years. So not anything particular was done at the time, but a couple of years later in 1922, a number of the daughters were headed to Mokule'a and decided, well, let's stop and look. And so when they went to the site and looked around, they realized, whoa, you know what, this really is kind of significant. So they went to Mr. Goodale, who actually, he fenced it off, but he re-cleared the whole thing. And then a committee of the daughters met with a delegation of some of the local Hawaiians in the area to talk about the next appropriate steps. So they heard all the stories, which are fascinating, really running out of time now, so I won't go into them. The daughters figured their biggest challenge was to keep the weeds out. Not what happened is word got out about the sacredness of the site. And people started saying, whoa, these stones are still miraculous and there's all these healings. The next thing they knew, the site was being absolutely overwhelmed. People were actually breaking off some of the rock and taking it away. Candles were being lit on top of the rock and melting wax all over, literally trashed the place. And it just kept getting worse. They tried a barbed wire fence. Didn't work. More stories kept going. And now Wahiawa was having huge traffic jams and now a health problem for the amount of offerings that were being left. So the people of Wahiawa got fed up, petitioned the Board of Health, who stepped in. Things kept going downhill. And in 1950, the daughters finally returned the property to, it was trust property, I won't go the ins and outs, but they returned it to Hawaiian Trust Company, who agreed to let one of the civic clubs become caretakers. Finally, in 1992, the state of Hawaii acquired the site. And that brings us to the last major project of the early daughters, which would be the acquisition and rehabilitation and fixing up of Hulihe Palace in Kona. Originally, it was the home of High Chief Kuakini, brother of Ka'ahumanu, who built it in 1838. After his death, it became a favorite vacation spot of both Princess Ruth and Queen Emma. Kalakaua purchased the property from Bishop Estate after those two died. But by 1911, the property had fallen really into quite a state of disrepair. Ownership had passed from Queen Kapiolani to her nephews, David Kawananakoa and Jonah Kalaniani'ole. They had little time to use it. In 1914, one of the daughter's members, she happened to be a daughter, but I don't think that's why she bought it, but Bathsheba Allen purchased the property. However, her primary residence was here in Honolulu, and the property was again ignored. After she passed, the estate trustee considered selling the property, and the daughters decided no, they should step in. So again, there was a long wrangle about the ins and outs because they really couldn't afford the purchase price, and they really wanted it to fall again under the guise of the government, and they would just be assigned more of a caretaker role, which eventually they did get done, but it took them until 1924 to get all the parts and pieces together for the grand opening. And I realized that I really am going late here. So they did have another grand, tremendous opening, and now they were formally into the running of museums, which, to kind of wrap up the big projects, what really became apparent is running a couple of museums on two different islands is really a big burden, and we kind of stopped looking for other things. I will say in the early years, they spent quite a bit of time and effort trying to get various road names changed and street names changed and things. And they actually did a lot of other good works. Kaiulani's banyan tree, they tried desperately to save, and a number of other things. But as I got into this talk, I realized there's way too much information. Oh, flip the slide. Let's have a quick peek at Hulihe. There's that old Hulihe from way back. Next one. And that's what it looked like. There's the daughters when they, in 1926, when they were first going up and saying, okay, let's figure this out. And the next slide, there's the ceremony of the opening. Just pride of authorship next to the Kahili, the woman standing there is my great-great-grandmother. I believe that's Irene Holloway up kind of behind her there. And next slide. That, then I actually was going to get into that. That was one of the things they got into, is they did put a plaque up on Thomas Square, honoring Kamehameha III, and that's where the Uamaukaeaukaina comes from, and the whole thing. Next slide. Sorry, hurrying now because I talked too long. That's Hulihe currently, what it looks like today. And next slide's the other side of it. That's from the ocean side. And then if we go to the next, we can see, oh, no, one more of that one. Sorry, I didn't realize I'd sent that. Now we flip up back to Nu'uanu, just showing you that there is a lot going on still today. That then is up at Hanaiakamalama. And one more. Daughters are still busy. They're still doing a lot. And so with that, I better wrap up and see if there's any questions, which I may or may not be able to answer. Sorry. Well, we have questions.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation. One of the questions that early on came in was Liliuokalani a member of the Daughters?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
I think it was an awkward time, to say the least. But a lot of the people she knew absolutely were there, a lot of staunch royalists were definitely first members of the Daughters, and a lot of noted people. I thought of making lists and lists of people, but I thought, do we want all the people? I mean, there was enough information. I was having a hard time getting all in.
Okay. Question, were men allowed to join the Daughters? I would think no.
Not until they could attend meetings, if appropriately accompanied by a member. And I think they were supposed to have been born here too, although that got overlooked every once in a while. But now Calabash cousins include men.
Do the Daughters still focus on preserving the Hawaiian language?
Even when I was regent, there has been a lot. We went back and around on it. And what in recent times that I can speak to, the decision kind of was, it's challenging enough to keep running the museums. And the University of Hawaii and other places really are the ones that really, it's a living language in a sense. There's some that are really trying to adhere to the old pronunciations. Who knows what that really was? And the Daughters decided, you know what, they weren't going to get in the middle of that game, and they'd leave it to the other experts at this point in time.
Okay.
And they did get totally frustrated with nomenclature, even though it's still in there and they'd still like to do it. it just got to be this losing battle of going down and saying, wait, change this, and nothing happened.
We have a request that you please repeat the names of the original group of daughters.
Oh, sure. I have to look to make sure I don't forget one. Emma Dillingham, Cornelia Jones, Annie Dickey, Ellen Weaver, Anna Paris, Lucinda Severance, and Sarah Waters.
Thank you. Who owned the Queen Emma Summer Palace before the restoration work began?
It had come down originally through Emma's uncle to when Emma received it.
Mhm.
After she went, it was actually sold. I don't remember the name, but it went through a couple different renters, and then eventually what is now the state got a hold of it.
Okay. Are there
Actually, what I should say, if you really, for everybody, and I believe it's still available, is the daughters they also got into the publishing business for a while and did do Nalani Kaumaka, which is a book about the daughters of Hawaii. Barbara Del Piano wrote it, and it really, what I realized is if you write a book, Ralph knows you got to stick to scope. There's so much more that could go in there, but there is a ton. And a lot of what I skipped, especially around the stories of Kukani Loko and these places, the backstories of histories of the palaces and everything is all in that book. So if you want to dive further, I highly recommend it.
fast forwarding to modern times? I know there was an earthquake that damaged Hulihe. How do the daughters cope with that sort of occurrence?
Fortunately speaking, with all the wrangling, it does actually belong to the state.
Okay.
And so we ended up working with DLNR, then falls down under DLNR. And so we worked hand in hand with the appropriate people, but fortunately didn't have to pay the bulk of the cost. The other real issue has been the seawall, which has also been an issue, but again, fortunately DLNR has to step up. Although they can be very slow, can be very frustrating.
Okay. Andrew put a link to the Barbara Del Piano book in the chat if anyone's interested in that.
And I have to plug. I mean, if you actually bought it up at one of the palaces, that would be even better than going to Amazon. But
So there's a gift shop at
both palaces
Hanaiakamalama.
have a gift shop. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
What are the current preservation challenges for each of the palaces?
Oh, phew. I know when I was on the board, we did a major overhaul of the Edinburgh room, the Mauka end of Hanaiakamalama. And because it's the wall that faces Mauka, so it gets most of the rain and all of that. So, rain in Nu'uanu is a thing. You just have to stay on top of it. Over the years, the shutters have had to be replaced, rain damage. We were, it's an ongoing battle. I mean, and it's that kind of any house that's old, you have to stay on top of maintenance, especially for Hanaiakamalama, the wet, Hulihe, salt water. There's your issues.
How can people support the daughters in their efforts?
Donations are always welcome and most appreciated, but it can be a really great organization. Volunteering and becoming a member, obviously.
Okay. Well, I think we've reached maybe one more question. Let's see if one comes up. What is the process of becoming a daughter? My mother was a daughter.
Then it's actually easier in a sense. They do have the appropriate form. You can go on site, daughtersofhawaii.org, and get the form, or you can go to one of the sites and fill it out. You do have to prove your genealogy, but if your mother, for instance, is a daughter, you can just say, hey, this is who my mother. It's a lot easier than if nobody in your family has, and then you have to actually track back and provide a genealogy that says, see, this person who is my great great grandmother or whoever lived then.
Thank you so much. I'll let Andrea wrap up the meeting.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Patricia.
You bet.
I wish we had more time. It's really fascinating, and thank you, Ralph, for leading the Q&A. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you to my colleague, Michelle Kisek, who's been providing technical support as well. And we hope that you will join us next Wednesday, February 21st at noon for Kekuewa Kikiloi's presentation on Henry Inoka Palanapa Kekuhuna. And if you are not yet signed up for the Historic Hawaii Foundation e-newsletter, please do so at historichawaii.org. Thank you for supporting this series, our work, for caring about preservation and places in Hawaii, and for doing all the things that you all do. And with that, you can support directly to Historic Hawaii. Join us at historichawaii.org. With that, we say ahui ho until next week, and have a wonderful week. And thank you so much. Mahalo.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.